Eliot Hart didn't believe in grand gestures. Not really, but something about that particular Valentine's Day made him pause halfway through sipping his morning coffee. He was staring out the frosted kitchen window of his Brooklyn apartment, watching the sky try to decide between rain and snow. When the idea struck him, it wasn't love. It wasn't even romance. If he was honest, just a gesture, simple, polite, expected. He had been casually seeing a girl from his friend's art circle. Nothing serious, nothing certain, but still, being a bouquet wouldn't hurt. He clicked onto the florist's site during a break between emails and picked out a bundle of soft pink tulips. Subtle, sweet, safe, just enough to say I remembered, but not enough to say I'm in love. Tulips reminded him of something gentle, something you give when you're unsure of what you're allowed to feel. He typed in her address quickly, letting muscle memory fill in the blanks. A number here, a digit there. Typed it all in without checking. His mind was already back on the half-finished floor plan, waiting on his screen. With one click, the order was placed. He got the confirmation an hour later while warming up leftover pasta, then forgot about it. No reply that evening. No thank you text. No these are lovely. Nothing. The next morning, still no message. He checked his phone more than he wanted to admit. Opened the delivery receipt again. It said it had arrived. Someone had accepted the flowers. But whoever that someone was, they weren't answering. By the third day, Eliot let out a slow breath and let the whole situation fade into silence. Maybe she'd realized what he already knew deep down, that he wasn't fully in it, that his eyes didn't soften the way hers did, that when they kissed, his mind wandered to a version of himself that still didn't feel seen, not even by himself. He told himself it didn't matter. It had just been a misaligned spark. Nothing burned. Nothing bloomed until the knock. It came at dusk, just as Eliot had settled into the kind of stillness that feels lonelier than noise. He opened the door, and there stood a man, slightly taller than him, tousled dark hair, a canvas tote slung across his chest, as if he'd just stepped in from a bookstore. In his hands, the tulips. The same tulips Eliot had sent days ago. I think these might have been meant for someone else, the man said, a cautious smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. They landed at 5C. I almost tossed them, but they were too pretty for the trash. Eliot blinked, staring at the blooms like they'd come back from the dead. Oh, he said, finally. Yeah, they weren't for you. I sent them to someone else, but she didn't answer. The man nodded slowly, still holding the bouquet gently, like it might bruise. Her loss, he said. You've got good taste, though. And then, just before turning back down the hall, he added, if you ever need help picking out flowers again, aim right down the hall. Eliot closed the door with the tulips back in his hands. They were beginning to wilt at the edges, petals softening into transparency, but they were still whole, still beautiful. And suddenly, they didn't feel like a mistake anymore. That night, he placed them in a jar on his kitchen table, not because he hoped the girl would call, but because something strange had taken root. Not in the bouquet, but in the space the stranger's voice had left behind. Sometimes the wrong door still leads you home, and sometimes the things we send out without intention come back exactly the way we needed, for stories where life's detours lead to the right destination. Subscribe to Heart Story. Stay for part 2 because Eliot is about to send another bouquet, and this one won't be a mistake. Eliot didn't sleep well that night, not because of noise or work or the usual static in his mind that kept him awake, but because every time he turned over in bed, the image of the man at his door kept slipping back into focus. The casual confidence, the warm way he said too pretty for the trash, the way he held the tulips like they still mattered, even though they were never meant for him. By morning, the stems had started to droop. The water in the mason jar was cloudy. But Eliot didn't throw them out. He didn't go online to look for new matches. Didn't text the girl again. Instead, he pulled on a sweatshirt, walked to the corner florist, and bought a new bouquet. This time, bright yellow tulips. He didn't overthink it. He just knew they felt like a restart. Not a romantic declaration, just something honest. He slipped a folded note between the petals. 4 words, scrawled in ink, thought you deserved your own. He left the flowers at the door of 5C, didn't knock, didn't wait, just walked back to his place with a flutter of adrenaline that felt sharper than coffee. That afternoon, something slid under his door. A yellow sticky note, no name, just handwriting, looped and steady. Do you send flowers to all your neighbors? Or was I just lucky? He stared at it for a long time. That weekend, they got coffee, nothing formal, no pressure, just 2 people sitting across from each other at a tiny table in a cramped cafe. Eliot ordered his usual black pour-over. The man, Caleb, as he introduced himself, got a chai latte with oat milk and zero apology for it. They talked about the neighborhood first, then about the coffee shop's playlist, which Caleb claimed was stuck in a French jazz from YouTube phase. Eliot laughed, more than once. They spoke about work. Eliot mentioned design. Caleb shared he illustrated children's books and worked part-time at the coffee place a few blocks over. They didn't talk about dating, or Valentine's Day, or what the flowers had meant. And maybe that was why it felt different. There were no questions asked that needed dodging. No pauses where Eliot had to calculate who he was supposed to be. Caleb didn't ask him if he was seeing someone. He didn't assume anything. He just listened, without leaning in too close, without filling silence, without trying to impress. The hours passed in gentle waves. At one point, Eliot glanced at the window and saw the sky dimming. It startled him. Time hadn't moved this fast in years. When they said goodbye, there was no awkward shuffle, no hesitation about who should text first, just a quiet understanding that something had been planted. They met again, then again. It became a rhythm. Tuesday coffees, Saturday bookstore runs, walks through the neighborhood where neither of them talked too much or too little. Eliot found himself looking forward to those hours. Not because Caleb made him feel excited or chased, but because he made Eliot feel settled, like he could stop running, like he didn't have to armor himself with coded language or vague stories, like he could just be. He didn't tell anyone yet, not his sister, not his co-workers, but he started to feel it inside himself, something growing in the space he'd spent years keeping empty. One evening, Eliot passed Caleb's door on the way up and noticed something new taped beside the number 5C, a small sketch of tulips in black ink, drawn with delicate lines and soft shading. It looked like it had been torn from a journal. He didn't say anything, but when he got home, he smiled. Sometimes, people don't come into your life with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes they arrive holding something you never expected to see again. A version of yourself you forgot was allowed to exist. One that doesn't need permission to feel. And sometimes, all it takes to find that version is a flower meant for someone else, landing in the hands of someone who sees you. By the time April settled in, the ritual had become quiet but constant. Eliot would leave for work and pass the door of 5C. Sometimes there'd be a note taped to it, a small doodle, a lyric, a sentence from a book he hadn't read. Other times, Caleb would be walking in the same direction, coffee in hand, nodding with a sleepy smile like they'd always lived in sync. And the tulips never stopped. They changed color, changed variety, changed meaning. Once it was white tulips with a note that said, "Peace is harder than noise." Another time, dark purple ones, almost black, with no message at all. Caleb never asked for them, never made a comment about the percent or the attention, but he always made space for them, on his windowsill, on his kitchen shelf, or sometimes sketched into the corner of his notepad. Eliot noticed things, the way Caleb rubbed his thumb across the rim of his mug when he was thinking, how he tilted his head slightly before responding to anything personal. He was soft-spoken, but never vague. He didn't fill silences with small talk. He listened like it mattered. One evening, after a walk that had stretched longer than usual, they sat on Eliot's fire escape and watched the lights across the city flicker on. One by one, Caleb pointed at a window in a building across the street. A woman was dancing alone in her living room, arms swaying like no one was watching. "I used to do that," Eliot said softly. Caleb smiled without turning. "Used to, Eliot didn't answer right away. Then he confessed what he hadn't told anyone, that most of his past relationships had been smokescreens, ways to deflect, performances, that he'd spent so long constructing a version of himself that could pass. He'd forgotten which parts were real. "I thought if I just waited long enough, maybe I'd become him," he said. "The guy who liked girls, the guy who fit." Caleb didn't interrupt, just let the air hold the weight of those words. Then he said, "I came out because I didn't want my art to lie for me." They didn't talk much after that. The wind filled the spaces that words couldn't. When Caleb left that night, he touched Eliot's shoulder once, brief and grounding, like a reminder that the truth wasn't something to run from. Days passed. The seasons inched towards summer. Eliot found himself rearranging his apartment, not because Caleb was coming over, but because the air felt different now. He changed the lighting, bought a new plant, even framed one of Caleb's sketches, a line drawing of tulips, simple and honest. He didn't tell anyone they were seeing each other. Not yet. But he didn't hide it either. When his sister called and asked about his week, Eliot talked about the bookstore visit with Caleb. When his coworker asked why he smiled at his phone during lunch, Eliot didn't deflect. It wasn't a loud shift, but it was real. Then one afternoon, as they stood in Caleb's kitchen, music low, a lemon tart cooling on the counter, Eliot noticed a corkboard on the wall. Pinned across it were cards, torn envelope corners, and faded florist tags. All of them handwritten, all of them his. He traced one with his finger. It read, "You deserved your own." "You kept these?" he asked. Caleb shrugged. "Every flower you send is a version of you trying to say something you don't know how to say yet. I guess I like watching you try." Eliot didn't respond, but he didn't need to. His chest felt full, not with fear, not with shame, but with the fragile, blooming sense of being understood. Some people believe love is thunderous, sudden, irresistible, but sometimes it's a slow accumulation of gestures. A bouquet left at the right door, a note under a coffee cup, a quiet, steady hand that doesn't let go, even when you don't know what to hold on to. And in those spaces where fear used to live, something new begins to grow. Not just love, but the courage to live truthfully, even when it's easier to pretend. It happened in late June. On a weekend Eliot had been dreading for months. His sister's engagement party was in Ohio, a full house, extended family, childhood neighbors, his parents' scrutinizing smiles. It wasn't that they were cruel, they were just deeply traditional. And Eliot had long ago learned how to perform polite, agreeable, non-controversial, always single, always focused on work, always neutral. He packed the week before with Caleb watching from the foot of his bed. "Do they know?" Caleb had asked gently. Eliot had paused mid-fold. "About us." He forced a smile. "They don't really ask." Caleb didn't push. He never did. But the silence that followed stretched just a little longer than usual. Eliot kissed him on the forehead before he left, whispering, "I'll call you." He meant it at the time, but once he was home, the old version of himself took over, the agreeable one, the version that laughed at uncle jokes and dodged conversations. He avoided bringing Caleb up. When his mother asked if he was seeing anyone, Eliot said, "Not really." The lie tasted bitter but familiar. The days dragged. He wanted to text. He didn't. He drafted messages in his head, deleted them before typing. Caleb sent a single photo, a bouquet of orange tulips, captioned with nothing but a question mark. Eliot didn't answer. When he returned to Brooklyn, his apartment felt dimmer. like the air had forgotten how to move. The mason jar on the windowsill held only cloudy water. The last bouquet had wilted beyond saving. He didn't hear from Caleb the next day, or the one after. On the fourth day, Eliot stood outside 5C with his knuckles hovering just above the door. He didn't knock. He listened for movement, but the hallway remained silent. Eventually, he walked back to his place, sat on the edge of his bed, stared at the wall where Caleb's sketch used to hang. It was gone, taken down sometime while he was gone. Eliot opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out the last bouquet he'd bought before leaving. Still wrapped, still sealed, but never delivered. Pale yellow tulips, now limp and bruised at the tips. He'd meant to give them the morning he left for Ohio. Instead, he'd buried them beneath paperwork and travel chargers. He sat there for a long time. The silence in the apartment felt heavier than it ever had before. It wasn't Caleb's silence that hurt. It was the one Eliot had created. The absence of truth he'd let settle between them. That night, Eliot wrote a new note, not on florist stationery, just a torn piece of paper from a grocery list. His handwriting wasn't neat. His words weren't poetic. This was never about flowers. It was always about you. He left the tulips outside 5C the next morning. Then he walked away, not expecting forgiveness, just needing the silence to be honest. Finally, in the days that followed, nothing came. No sticky notes, no sketches. The hallway felt colder. Eliot still walked past the door every day, but never stopped. He didn't replace the jar in his kitchen, didn't send more tulips, didn't start seeing anyone new. The air inside him was changing, slowly, painfully. And yet, something small had shifted. Eliot started speaking more honestly, at work, with his sister, even in the mirror, not loudly, not completely, but with less fear, because silence, he realized, isn't neutral. Sometimes it's a kind of erasure, one we choose for ourselves out of convenience, or shame, or habit. But the cost of pretending is high. It takes the color out of our lives, petal by petal, until nothing living remains. And love, real love, can only grow where honesty is allowed to breathe. A year later, the tulips were blooming again. This time, not in a mason jar or on a stranger's doorstep, but across an open field in Vermont, where rows of yellow petals swayed like quiet witnesses under a clear spring sky. Eliot stood near the altar, adjusting his cufflink with unsteady fingers, then turned to look behind him. The chairs were filling up slowly, not with hundreds, just the few who mattered. His sister sat in the second row, dabbing her eyes already. A friend from college held a Polaroid camera. The florist flitted around with final touches, pinning corsages and brushing pollen from the white table linens. In the center of it all, beside the rows of chairs, stood a small wooden table. Not grand, not even varnished, just natural, raw wood, the kind Caleb loved. On it were no name cards, no seating charts, only a spread of cream-colored envelopes. Inside each envelope was a piece of Eliot's journey, notes he had written across the year. Some were florist tags, some were sticky notes he'd kept from Caleb. Some were sentences that had never found a voice, printed now in soft black ink. Every guest would receive a piece of the story without knowing where it belonged in the timeline. Caleb had called it a ceremony of fragments. Eliot called it truth, finally whole. He remembered the moment things had shifted. It wasn't grand or loud, just a quiet evening, weeks after he had left the last bouquet at 5C. He was walking back from the corner store, rain in his hair, when the elevator dinged and Caleb stepped out, holding that very bouquet, wrapped now in new paper, refreshed. "I couldn't throw them away," Caleb had said softly, "but I couldn't bring them in until I knew you meant it." Eliot had nodded. No excuses, just the truth. "I did. I do." And now, under the tulip canopy, he watched as Caleb approached. Dark navy suit, a small boutonniere pinned to his lapel, a single yellow tulip, same smile, same steady warmth. No one had rehearsed this moment, but nothing about them had ever followed a script. They exchanged vows in the middle of that blooming field, barefoot on the soft grass. Eliot spoke first, a voice that shook but didn't break. "The first bouquet I ever sent was a mistake," he said, looking into Caleb's eyes. "But it brought me to the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't one." Caleb reached into his pocket and unfolded a faded piece of paper. Eliot's old note, still creased at the corners. "This was never about flowers," he read aloud. "It was always about you." The guests clapped, some cried, someone laughed. A breeze passed over the field, lifting the tulip petals gently. The sun leaned in. After the ceremony, a young boy from the flower farm walked over with a box. "Someone left this at the gate," he said. Said it was for the groom. Eliot took it with curiosity, unwrapping the brown paper slowly. Inside was a handwritten card. No return address, no name. Just a short message: "You never got my text, but I'm glad you got the right door." The girl, from that first bouquet, the one who never answered. She had seen the story unfold, perhaps through mutual friends, or the local florist, or fate. Eliot smiled, lips pressed into the kind of gratitude that had no words. He folded the card and slipped it into his jacket pocket, then turned back to Caleb. They danced long after the sun went down. The lights strung through the trees like little constellations. The tulips around them glowed gold in the fading light. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with a mistake, and sometimes the only way to find your way home is to send love out into the world, even if it lands somewhere unexpected. Because love, when real, always finds its way back. And now tell me this, have you ever made a mistake that turned into the best thing in your life? Drop your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story, where every misstep might just be the beginning of something unforgettable.